Welcome to the long journey of acquiring a professional doctorate, or to what Paul said recently was scholastic incarceration when he was congratulating Salford's first graduate of its program, Dr. Paul Crow. Is Paul here this morning, I'm assuming, because he's got a session, I know?
I think he's arriving about 12-ish.
Okay, right. I want to add my congratulations to his accomplishment also. I've got 3 characteristics in mind this morning in today's workshop: linking robust practice with rigorous research. I call what you are doing a practice-led doctorate, and I see it underpinned by 3 particular challenges. One is to engage it in your own voice, to live it fully in the first person, I, or me. Another one is to remember you're doing this within an academic community. Paul referred to the requirement for academic legitimacy. And you know that British higher education in particular is a citadel historically isolated from the real world. So there's a challenge in that. And a third underpinning, which I think is fundamental to what you're doing, is that you are invited to deal in practice-led research with its social nature, what I'm beginning to call its plurality, as I think about it. And this presents intriguing, if not unique or even intractable, choices for you. So each of these 3 characteristics presents its own distinctive difficulty, and this morning I'd like to unpack those a bit, specify and elaborate their properties, and use some practical and conceptual illustrations. And at the end of each one, I'll be posing a question as to how you might best consider maximizing the gain, the upside, the opportunity in the challenge to make your long haul learning full, literally full of learning. For you, for others, for you personally and for you professionally, convivially and intellectually, ultimately, I hope, worthwhile. In preparation for this morning, as I've continued to ponder these 3 fundamentals, I've come to frame them as 3 sides of that classical argument. My starting point is a hypothesis. But my next point is its antithesis. It stands opposite to my initial assumption. And the third side, I hope, becomes a way of synthesizing the 2. So I'm assuming there is an argument for the scholarly practitioner to engage a professional doctorate in her or his own voice. But I and you and your supervisors all know this writing is going to be presented within an academic community, where established traditions in scholarship exclude the researcher having a voice. How can they? They're barely human. So that's a counter-argument to my starting point, my assumption. So what might help reconcile the contradiction? Practice-led inquiry is full of intriguing contradictions and tensions which arise from its social nature. These offer choices to you as a researcher. from previewing their appearance in the first place to actually researching how you contended with them at the end of the day. Because of their challenging nature, I'm tempted now to try calling them the problematics of plurality. And I think on your handout I was calling it the other way around. My position on this third area of the social nature of your enterprise is that you can increase a reader's confidence in taking your contribution to the stock of knowledge seriously by trying to address these problematics of plurality. You enhance the plausibility of your substance, what it is you have come to know and to find out. And by attempting to reconcile some of these social problematics, to reflect on the process of how you dealt with them, you elevate the credibility of the methodology of your study, how you come to arrive at what you think you know. Well, that's a bit to begin with. Let's get on to the hypothesis and try and unpack it a bit. Challenge 1, the instrument is my voice. Let's start at the end point, where Paul Crow, it's nice to be able to talk about him not here, was sitting recently. It's called a viva. It's live, man. You're defending your thesis. John is going to, I think, highlight some of the things an examiner keeps an eye out for later in the day. You're doing this spontaneously, on your feet, your words against their words. A panel of examiners. Now, if Paul was here, I'd ask him, did those examiners, that panel, sit on either side of you? No. They probably sat opposite him because they are there to oppose his thinking. That's their job. And your job, note the choice of the word, the metaphor, is to defend your thesis. We're talking ritual here. And you know from organizational life that ritual is for real. I'm going to digress for a second. I was once an external at Oxford, and the candidate had to, I mean this, knock on the door of the tutor's office. I don't know if it was knock 3 times, and had to respond to questions with rehearsed lines in an exchange through the closed door, which probably went back centuries, before she was even let in the room wearing an academic gown. That was the beginning of her viva. And I also have in mind a viva of a different quality, a different experience for me, and it's a precursor to our first challenge of engaging a practice-led doctorate in your own voice. It was of the last PhD student I supervised some 3 years ago. He finished up. Like many of you, a mature, reflective, well-read entrepreneur. His study, like most of yours, was practice-based. His career had spanned the globe. Community video in remote villages in the third world, social media to reduce natural disasters, applied now within international disaster relief supported by the UN. Vast experience at the forefront of participation, of communities of practice, of horizontal learning among groups. You name it, Terry had engaged these things in the real world of practice, and he wanted now to account for them conceptually. And perhaps, as you will come to learn, just about all his starting points, all his starting assumptions about communication channels and power relations and about influencing people, about people taking responsibility for their own development. All these assumptions were now left in tatters, like detritus along the ascent of Everest. His viva seemed to go on and on, not because his argument had come unstuck or his thesis had been poorly presented, but because the two examiners were requiring. They knew, I came to see later, they had a strong candidate here, a wide-ranging yet nevertheless focused study, so they could let loose their shelling and see how he would hold up under the bombardment. And hold up he did. But it was now after 2 o'clock. I was hungry. How could Terry continue? He must be ready for collapse. The external signals, no more questions. But not the internal. One last question, Terry, he begins, smiling. I think to myself, oh, Chris, come on, you're a colleague. You're not going to put the knife in now, are you? He actually used to work here at Salford. My blood sugar was obviously low. I enjoyed reading your thesis, Terry. People are real in it. You come through. So what about you? How have you learned? How have you learned? What possibly more can Terry add? What can he summon up? He pauses, like I am. Then he begins very deliberately. It may sound heavy. It was the first time in my career I have become authentic. The first time in the career of this competent professional, global experience all over the place, all kinds of stakeholders, aid officials, peasants, bureaucrats, academics, and he had now finally become authentic. Woo! I still feel that charge in me in reliving that moment. Good you, Terry, good you. So your keynote this morning on the long haul of a professional doctorate begins with a simple yet fundamental question. Will you dare to express yourself authentically? Not just on paper and in text, but in saying and talking about what is exhilarating you, what is frustrating you over the length of the doctorate. To live a journey of the intellect in a body which also has a mind and emotions and a soul. You won't be alone if you feel cautious in taking this risk with an audience. 100 years ago, the poet Yeats reached a stage in his well-established career where he chose to no longer ape the conventional style of the day. Rejecting its elaborated embroidery, he wrote, "There's more enterprise in walking naked. There's more enterprise in walking naked." Can you similarly perhaps risk writing and speaking honestly in simple, direct language about the experience of your long haul? And can you anticipate how much, if you're just starting your journey now, how much in the coming months that academia, intentionally and otherwise, will try to put you back in embroidery class, to alter what you say and how you say it. As a first-time supervisor, I did it all the time with my PhD candidates. But don't forget, some, perhaps much of the day-to-day success you have accumulated in your real job as a practitioner lands you here today as a scholarly practitioner because you are able to deal directly with matters. So how can you continue to communicate directly as before, but now presenting your thinking perhaps more provisionally? Might this be the way to reframe the challenge of living in your own voice? In submitting a professional doctorate, you may well have to adjust your tone, alter your timbre, encourage the reader to be persuaded through quiet self-evidence, not bold claim. So can you become sensitive, if you are not already, to the possibility of raising the impact of your message by lowering the volume of your voice? In the age of texts and tweets and Twitters, with a subtle difference on a reader's appreciation of how you craft a verb tense, hold your attention sufficiently in your desire to sculpt your text convincingly. Also, you may be tempted from previous study or from your own problem-solving business style to be definitive, to say what is right, to give hard answers to proper questions, to cite facts. This orientation to certainty and knowing may have served you well to move fast in a hard business environment. You may have succeeded in influencing others with your leading technical acumen. But now, in a new endeavor where you're encouraged to share your one particular version of reality, being so definite or so sure of yourself may serve you less well. There will be others who inhabit that reality and think they know their own version of it too. That's why we may refer to a phenomenological perspective, to embrace multiple realities by observing phenomena through more than one lens. The goal is always to give the reader confidence, to trust that your use of self as the chief instrument in telling a story is sensitively deployed, consciously calibrated. So part of this first challenge in the long journey through your professional doctorate might become your own confidence to play with tentative propositions or rigorous speculation. And in the process, like I am trying to do here at times, use language differently, perhaps a bit creatively, yet with integrity. A practical place where less certainty and more vulnerability in expressing your voice might be a benefit is in interviewing. Do you feel you have to approach an interviewee in your doctorate in the same way you approach a key client or a pivotal board member in your job? To be thoroughly prepared, avoid stupid questions, show them you know what you're good at. Yet good reporters who get behind the scene and write stories that impact their readers might not agree with that approach. Creative bumbling is what they call it, when they deliberately appear dumb. One experienced writer, also a tutor of aspiring journalists, put it this way: you can develop a distinct advantage by waxing slow of wit. Evidently, you need help. Who is there to help you but the person who is answering your questions? So how prepared are you to consider shifting into a new requirement for expressing yourself? Can you, in taking on a new role now as a part-time social scientist on top of a regular full-time job as an architect or surveyor or whatever, imagine your remit is to take what, quote, peaks as mere notion, and mold it to its proper shape. These disciplined creative acts offer us, quote, lessons in the proper uses of perception. The proper uses of perception. In how best to distribute our curiosity. The lovely phrase in qualitative research, distribute our curiosity. This aware distribution of our curiosity, I think, is part of a proper academic discipline, which we as subjects beholding objects sensitively and awarely manage. But remember, you are the instrument. As Rolf Linton, quoted above, an extremely methodological social scientist committed to ground-level inquiry, puts in his book, which he obviously subtitled in his own voice, Themes on My Blue Guitar, put it, one's measure of the world and the position taken in it cannot be truer than the instrument. Cannot be truer than the instrument. The practitioner, myself. So, having honed our observational sensibility truly with truth, we can then, to adapt another of Linton's phrases, promote to meaning a fresh emphasis in the sense we and others might be forming of that part of the world we are putting under the microscope. Let me pause for a second. How are some of these metaphors landing on you now? I am, after all, living here in the moment in my own voice. Perhaps my images are not resonating with you. Perhaps you would want me to speak more directly to you. Can you believe I think I am? So in terms of this first challenge of living in your own voice, ask yourself, just how comfortable with the clarity of the concrete and literal are you? And how comfortable are you with the imagery of archetype and symbol? Robert Frost, the American poet, worried that unless we were, quote, at home in the metaphor, unless we had our proper, quote, poetical education in the metaphor, we are not safe anywhere. Do you think he had vibers in mind? Think of Terry and that knockout answer in the last round of his title fight. Did he answer directly? Did he answer concretely with a list of how he had learned? Or metaphorically? I have become authentic. He was on safe ground, putting his examiners at home with the metaphor. At the end of the day, despite your best planning and its approved design, your research will become messy. Many of you know that already. Replete with what Karen Locke, another advocate of inquiry grounded in first-hand data, calls discrepancies between the coherence articulated in representations of research processes and the disjointedness of research as an act in progress. So will you dare to present the reality of your disjointed act in progress? Or will you render it all neat and tidy, a coherent representation as it was taught to you in all those research methods workshops of how research is supposed to go? Can you choose to be honest and tell an examiner, who may be one of those methods module instructors, that your research questions came unstuck? Your data collapsed. Your original focus led nowhere. That in fact, there are times, despite all the flaming modules and all the repetitive textbook guidance, where you simply weren't sure what to do next. A mature PhD candidate in the Mediterranean emailed his supervisor when he didn't know what to do next. All he could think about was finishing the bloody thesis, not learning how to construct it. His supervisor had just critiqued a draft sharply. Subject, PhD chapters, date, Wednesday, 7th March, 2001, 09:15. Dear Pete, thanks for your feedback. Oh yes, you are right. It did jolt me. But I think I needed that. To be honest with you, I am in a state of confusion, and I don't know what I want from my research anymore. I don't know what I want from my research anymore. I am scared. The time factor is also working against me now. Conducting the questionnaires and the interviews and analyzing the results is very time consuming. I was planning to dedicate the next 4 or 5 months on this and then start writing up. Am I being too ambitious? Please give me some more suggestions. I am lost in Gozo. Dear Lost in Gozo. That was a good email, Joe. Very open and accountable. Owning your worst doubts and fears. Very uncomfortable feelings that pervade one's soul, especially in the non-feeling domain of higher degree research. Things will probably feel worse before they feel better. So keep in mind, feelings are real, but they are not reality. Individual interviews do generate much data. As you say, conducting and analyzing them are very time consuming. And that is what a PhD is. I do think your recent time frame is unrealistic. You still need a wider database. P.S. I can think of worse places to be lost. Joe adapted his timescale, reground himself into actual practice, and learned how to do research by doing it. His text flowed, his voice flourished. His thesis was assessed, quote, a totally innovative contribution, relevant in methodology, successful in its outcomes. What you have before you in confronting this first challenge in the long haul of living in your own voice is nothing less than a fundamental criterion for human growth the world over: the capacity to reconcile contradictions. As a leader or professional in the real world of business and technical life, you do this all the time successfully. Faced daily with tensions and disparities and disappointments. The opportunity to strengthen this capacity during your long haul makes it especially worthwhile. A transferable skill strengthened for the rest of your life. So are you able to hold both and? To own both your certainty and your doubt? your knowledge and your ignorance, your authority and your vulnerability. Finally, a seed question. Who among all those in the enterprise of your professional doctorate is best placed to help you locate the strengths to do this? To confront your reluctance when you fail to do it sufficiently. To bring parallel experience of knowing what you were going through by going through it themselves. Give that some thought today. Challenge 2. The community is academic. My starting point here is from playing sports as a kid. You play by the rules of the ballpark you're in. You might be returning to academia an optimist or even idealist, excited to reach a broad conclusion on how to reshape an entire business sector. An academic response might be just to draw a slim line under reshaping a single sentence. I once asked a person like you who knew a great deal about their work-related topic before they even stepped back onto the campus, how they knew something. She was a highly competent agriculturalist from Sudan, now in the UK on a full scholarship, to put out in a doctorate what she knew was inside her. Halfway through the seminar, I pick up on something she's claiming. I want her to slow down, act more like a thinker, less like an activist. So I ask her slowly, Amina, how do you know something? Her supervisor beams a smile in my direction. I have just warranted his unorthodox request that I, with no knowledge of her subject matter, join his examining panel. How do you know something? That's a question worthy of doctoral study. So as in Mina's case above, what will it take to convert what is already embedded in your bones, in your blood, your heart, your head, into another form of externalized knowledge, which a new reader or listener can equate with being worthy of examination? So that readers who do not want to believe you, so that readers who do want to believe you, who are on your side, even if sitting opposite you, damn those metaphors again, can be satisfied. They can be assured upon seeing and hearing this symbolic rendition of how you know something that you warrant the title of doctor. The ticket to a professional doctorate says in the small print, the holder agrees to venture off-piste onto unfamiliar terrain, and to learn to communicate with the aliens in their code how he or she knows something. Retain this ticket for regular inspection on your long journey. An academic's voice is louder than yours. You're on their court. It's their ball. If you don't already have primary evidence, you soon will that a trajectory up an academic career does not typically include a tick box for listening skills. Or for that matter, teamwork. There's some good exceptions, I think, in this program. Just like a business entrepreneur prizes the distinctive positioning of the reputation of their product, so too does the aspiring academic. He typically he yearns for acceptance within his discipline by publishing just outside it. to differentiate his USP among peers. Some academics self-regulate what is called here their disciplinary libido. They can anchor rich multidisciplinarial instincts alongside properly internalized standards for evidence. But others, alas, overestimate the distinctive contribution they think they are making. As Ken Wilber warns us, where evidence is erased, narcissism flourishes. One's grip on evidence-based views of reality becomes loosened by, quote, egoic fantasies and self-centered ways. The Academy is not exempt from contradictions. Academics do not hold a monopoly on truth. But perhaps academia is better at giving information than at seeking it. If you learn best by being psychologically understood rather than simply cognitively talked over, ask yourself this question: who else might be in a good place to support and challenge you to self-discover and reframe the meaning of your long haul? Getting ready to go on to challenge 3. You stand one more, it's the trickiest. This is the hardest one. Reconciliation, excuse me, and synthesis. And it's always the most important. I'll take you inside here to try and illustrate how I've been challenged by this one. And I'm going to give you just an overview of how I'm approaching it now. I'm afraid these metaphors are not going away. Somewhat in a similar spirit to beginning the keynote on slightly classical formal lines of an argument, 3 parts of an argument, I'm going to use the image of languaging here. First person, I, me. Second person, you, the other. Third person, it, everything else. A preview of the first person. We have many selves. We carry different identities. We function in different roles. We inhabit multiple personas. In practice-led research, we tap into all these varying intrapersonal beings constantly over time. Second person. There are others out there, a lot of them. They contribute to and construct, and in some cases block, your research. Colleagues who let you interview them. Academics who critique and guide your study. Readers you won't even meet. You may hear about them. Third person on our preview. There come to be things which can be linked and put into sequence or progression. I'm going to lump them under the term relationships to do with your practice-led inquiry. So these are social. They are plural, more than one. These things evolve and influence what you are doing and how it is perceived. They are a plurality in relationship with one another and with other things. When we establish an aware relationship with our research, we invariably begin paying attention to similarities and differences. Similarities and differences. We compare and we interrelate patterns and distinctions. Practice-led doctorate, like a life, is an extended essay into noting differences between one thing and another, between this and that. And it is this sensibility which makes our third challenge in the long haul the hardest and potentially the most important, in my judgment. Conducting practice-led research invites many problematic choices. Many of you are appreciating that already. These choices, in turn, raise many implications for how you proceed and how you account methodologically for your procession. So why then might it be important to communicate in your text that you can differentiate one thing from another? Because that is how your reader will differentiate your text from another. How they will compare your way to saying how you know something with another person's way of saying that. And that's in your interest. So we'll spend some time unpacking the second and the third persons a bit more. There are others. I'll put this one down. The others include readers of your text, subjects providing data for you, a supervisor or two offering guidance, peers in your professional cohort. All these implications arise when personal investigation is undertaken socially. For example, how when approaching colleagues you work with whom you want to interview, possible research subjects, can you not treat them as real research objects? What ethical and political stances can you authentically adopt to ensure they feel they are contributing information as agents, that they're not being treated by you as if they were creatures from Mars? Are you committed to approach colleagues for data whom you know do not respect your pursuit of an advanced degree on the organization's time? And if you end up collaborating with others who willingly open their performance to your research, how do you incorporate these views into a socially configured analysis which nevertheless you remain as a sole journey? How do you retain legitimacy in your role as chief meaning maker in putting other people's private worlds into the public domain? And what about readers in that public domain? How, in presenting your text to a reader you have not met, nor ever will, can you establish a tone and attitude toward your subject matter which whets an appetite for reading? It doesn't regurgitate a bad taste. Other readers might include an interested boss. Perhaps she's wondering now what it is you've been slogging through all these months, and she asks for a preview now in writing before you are ready to share findings. Or a colleague concerned that the issue he shared 18 months ago in a recorded interview has now become really sensitive. So he seeks assurance that your confidentiality ground rules will shield his identity. Where, in fact, do you keep that tape recording you made? He asks with concern. The categories of others are many. You are co-constructing and residing in a complex social system for a long time. Final perspective, the third person. Here's a juicy, problematic example. The distinction between phenomena and data. You are aware that the two are not identical, I trust. Gregory Bateson stressed the fact that data are not events, but always records or descriptions or memories of events. We as social scientists, therefore, make choices in transforming these events, the phenomena, into the records or descriptions of them, the data. Immediately, all kinds of implications arise. Given that in practice there are more phenomena than data, quote, always and inevitably, according to Bateson, there is a selection of data. From the vast universe of phenomena, you will select in bits of data. Now, if you acknowledge a choice is being made here, more questions immediately confront you in accounting transparently in your thesis for the relationship you are having with your research. On what bases will you choose what to select in and what to select out? It's a fundamental consideration, and as a reader, I want to get a sense of it. What criteria will inform your choices? From where do these selection criteria derive? At what stage did you formulate them? How aware will you be of their origins, which now act as biases in privileging a methodological procedure? You're attracted to this data, these data, and you're not attracted to these data. Explain thyself. The degree to which one chooses to play with fundamental methodological questions like these, which grow out of fundamental philosophical issues like research being social, can constitute a measure of how invigorating the reader might find the methodology chapter in your thesis. And be forewarned, unaware bias in handling this major methodological conversion of phenomena into data leads to a slippery slope. Quote, in any investigation, each thing lying between the phenomena and the data is a source of error. Wow. That was written in 1969. This abstract caveat, I'll repeat it, in any investigation, each thing lying between the phenomena and the data is a source of error. This reminds us firsthand of the possible cost of over-reliance on temporary, contrived data generation techniques, like structured interviews or imported questionnaires. It invites reconsideration, perhaps, of more ongoing naturalistic data gathering, records of team meetings, notes made during conversations, which are a more organic part of practice and work, irrespective of the study going on. One way of reconciling the problematics of plurality in practice-led research is to proceed pragmatically. You cut corners responsibly in having to make imperfect choices informed by reality, not research methods textbooks. Ex post facto, you will end up intellectually justifying hand-to-mouth behavior, like the bricoleur, which Paul previewed this morning. You can pull from your toolbox what is called in qualitative analysis a chronological lie, a retrospective rationalization of what you did when at the time, in fact, you didn't have the foggiest notion why. If in the final analysis research is about perceiving differences, about noting the difference between this and that, between one thing and another, then two kinds of learning are also implied to do this. As a jack of all trades, bricolage, you have used both getting this far in your career. Bring them both to the campus. One is the mode which is happening during your research residentials and your methodology workshops, what Charles Egbu referred to as, I believe, mode 2. Being taught something which you learn before you go out and do it. This is the programmed syllabus of explicit know about. And just as in professional life, so it is in research, a necessary emphasis, but an insufficient one. You also require a second emphasis in learning how to do research, especially, in my experience, practice-led inquiry. The kind of learning which cannot be taught, perhaps only conceptualized after the event, through prompt switching from experience to reflection and back again. This quick interplay between doing and reviewing polishes the discernment between the this and the that. Professor John Morris, the first chair in management development in the UK, observed 40 years ago, from working with real managers, the same subtle iterative relationship. Quote, awareness comes much more powerfully out of experience, after experience, rather than preceding it. That's mode 1. But sometimes in higher education, that relationship becomes inverted. Early on, in later formal study that you're engaging, a collusive distortion takes place between the this and the that. Something becomes lost. When a facsimile of the phenomenon to be beheld in the mind's eye comes to precede the real eye's actual sight of it, David Bacan's source of error is at play. As Bateson put it also 40 years ago, records or descriptions or memories of events are not events. Will the real thing ever be seen? Can it ever be apprehended as it truly is? In research terms, this is that capacity to differentiate phenomena from data. This risk is as much at hand in researching as it is liable to happen while sightseeing. When a tourist hears the second-hand preview of the that before they see firsthand the this. Someone who has never visited the Grand Canyon in the United States may have heard about it for years, seen it in pictures, and then perhaps traveled thousands of miles, finally, to stand before its north or south rim and behold what is truly an awesome sight. But can they then, quote, see it for what it is? Because the Grand Canyon, the thing as it is, has been appropriated by the symbolic complex which has already been formed in the sightseer's mind. Seeing the canyon under approved circumstances is seeing the symbolic complex. Seeing the canyon under approved circumstances is seeing the symbolic complex head on. The thing has already been formulated by picture postcard, geography book, tourist folders, and the words Grand Canyon. As a result of this pre-formulation, the source of the sightseer's pleasure undergoes a shift, through which satisfaction is now measured by the degree to which the canyon conforms to the pre-formed complex. So too can taught research deflect your perception of the immediacy of a pure sighting. A methods module can redistribute your curiosity so that you don't peek at something as mere notion, but you record it as preconceived data. Academia teaches the approved circumstances for your making observations, pre-formulating how you are to use your perception. Someone else's preternatural explicit know about from the literature or from a tutorial or from a methods workshop can hijack your own ground level phenomenal apprehension. The this is now diminished. The that is now in the ascendant. All of us in the long haul of practice-led research at times become lost. Like Joe and Gozo, we won't know what we want any longer from our research. Like academics who pretend a preformed complex, like a literature preview, can be called a literature review because, as in the Dilbert cartoon, it all looks the same to them. If we are to make the truth of practice-led inquiry worthwhile, we need to keep learning from the this, the phenomenal experience, before the that of what other people think they know. We must let phenomena be a powerful stranger on our journey and find us so that we do not lose its fresh impact. When a young person asked a Native American elder, "What do I do if I'm lost in the forest?" the elder responded, "Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen, it answers, I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Thought-provoking as ever. We've got time for questions. I'm sure there will be questions.
Yes?
One question about
Mhm.
originality,
Mhm.
because your student or your supervisor, the person who said that for the first time he was being authentic. How do you know when you are being original, when what you are doing is original?
Original or authentic?
Original,
Okay.
not authentic.
Um,
How do you ground your originality sufficient to satisfy the criteria for professional doctorate?
Well, I think that raises a very proper question, and it's probably my first thinking would be that it's probably a matter of degree. I do not expect from a postgraduate a completely original contribution to the stock of knowledge. But I do expect, and I think it's generally required and as an expectation, as a standard, that there is a perspective which is being offered which hasn't been given adequate consideration so far. It might take account of other things that have been established, or it might challenge other things which have been established, and you bring more attention and more focus on something which, in that sense, is original, because it's been either under-researched, or you're bringing a different lens to something which has been researched a lot, and you're beginning to show another perspective on it, because that angle hasn't been investigated robustly or at all. So I think I'm hearing a little bit of that either or, it's original or not original, behind your question. And I think this is a place where it's a bit of both and. It's a contribution, a fresh contribution to the stock of knowledge. But I certainly, when I was involved in assessing or guiding, wouldn't expect a totally original contribution.
And I was trying
Does
to
that help a little bit, or?
It does. I was trying to reconcile that with what you said to this lady called Amina.
Mhm.
How do you know you know?
Yeah.
Stop being an activist.
Mhm.
And I find myself in exactly that position.
Sure.
People assume I'm an activist, but I think I'm just being original.
Uh-huh.
And
Okay.
so how do you
Okay.
reconcile
Well,
or
I would-
differentiate between the two?
I would then go back to you. What evidence do you have that you are acting originally?
Research into...
As an activist, I'm talking about.
As an activist?
Yes. That's what I understood you to say, that you see yourself acting originally.
No, I just see myself acting originally. I do not
Okay.
see myself
Well,
as an
what
activist.
evidence do you have that you act originally?
Because I haven't come across it before. Through the
So
research.
I need
the
to get-
evidence that I have is that whatever I do, people respond to it
Okay.
in a particular way.
Well, as your reader, if that point was being positioned, in helping to justify an emphasis in your methodology or the way that you were proceeding, I would want to get a feel for that evidence, which might be within your text, or it might be some samples in an annex or an appendix, which say, you know, 4 illustrations how the way I have historically I as a practitioner have historically approached challenges or initiatives. My sense is that this is seen as you know, original or out of the box or whatever. And it would partly depend upon the context of why that would be important, what would be important to you in establishing that in your text. But that would only be, as it were, your input side. Then, at the end of the day, what you say either communicates to me, and I haven't read everything in the world, and neither will the examiners, but you know, they're up to date on things, and if it's repeating and not adding a fresh perspective, they can tell. It's a proper question. I'm not sure whether I'm sure there'll be lots of other views on it, and especially from academics here. Yeah.
I was interested in what you said earlier about not needing to be definitive or not needing to have certainty when you're collecting evidence or data or having conversations with people, and the ideas about adjusting tone. I've left with a question around that in terms of the honesty of that, or circumstances that could arise, like the journalist approach, where you're kind of pretending not to know or pretending to be uncertain in order to extract some information from the other. And what are the issues around honesty in that relationship?
Well, I think that's another good query. The kinds of things that quickly go through my mind would be like, I see 2 legitimate ethical reasons for checking my understanding. One can be in feeding back to the person, I kind of expected that answer, or that's what I knew in putting that question to you or in hearing what you said. If I do the active listening and paraphrase back what I understand you're saying, often when a person hears what they've just said, a couple of different things can happen. They might say, well, yes, and actually, and in addition, they say something more, which may not be what I expected. So it helps them, by being reflective to them, it helps them, gives them more of a window or space to, well, there's another side to that also. Or I may, in my confidence that I know, have it wrong. And if I put it back accurately to them, they'll say, well, no, that's not really what I mean. What I mean is this. And now I've gotten into something which I didn't know. So I think a lot of this is, and lots of times, you know, even if I am trying to get an understanding of something I believe I know well, I probably don't. You know, there's lots of the other's world, even if we share, you know, a lot, where I can be wide of the mark, where I just won't have the edge that person will have. Because that, and I think that's all ethical behavior. I don't have a problem with, you know, there's no manipulation is something you can only get away with once, in my, you know, definition. That type of technique of checking out your understanding can be used repeatedly with a person. And if it's genuine, the person won't mind, because you're really taking the care to double check that you got it right.
Pete, can I thank you for your superb delivery there, and the level of issues you've raised. One of the things that confront students, especially prof-doc students or any PhD student, is the issue of decision making. They have to make choices, and you said in one of your discourse there, they have to note the differences between one thing and another. And decision making is about drawing from information. And too often we don't have perfect information. So we need to do what Tversky and Kahneman informed us. We need to satisfy, which means doing the best with the little information we do. Now, to what extent does that provide real challenge to postdoc students, especially those practitioners who have spent 30 years doing something which has worked for them, for which, for them, they've got all the information. They've tried and tested that. It's all worked. And coming to the academia where things are a little bit fluid, how do they marry this world of effective and constant decision making with inappropriate information at hand?
Well, I could not give full respect to the complexity of that question by just repeating, stand still. I think, again, like the other questions, this is a recurrent challenge. I tend, through my orientation and biases, to look at a lot of these things from the more psychological or even emotional thing. The issue behind that is the capacity of the individual to withstand uncertainty. It's one thing rationally to to make a the best kind of satisfying, is that
Yes,
the
satisfying.
response or judgment. But a lot of it has to do with how I feel about that, and how do I integrate that feeling in the fact that, I do have this rock solid understanding that this works in this circumstance, and now I'm this bloody professional doctorate student, and I've got to do something a little bit different. How is that person coping emotionally with that role shift? Because some people can transfer that capacity they developed for 30 years in professional life quite fluently into this next task. This is another task. And I think that's a tremendous ability to try and bring. You have made those, decisions in your career. Don't leave that stuff in coming to the campus. There is a capacity in there. Maybe become more alert to how the context of the mystique of academia, you failed your 11 plus, or you struggled through and you never saw yourself coming back to the campus as a mature candidate. There's a lot of that kind of baggage, emotional, psychological baggage we bring. And I would just say, try and name that stuff. Reflect on it, and don't let it get in your way to continue to do what you are good at.
Pete, can you explain again what you mean by my voice, by in my own voice? What exactly do you mean by that? Academia is based on what others say and reading what others say, scheduling what others say. Your own voice, where does that, how does that work?
Well, I think there's different manifestations of what I mean by that. In a straightforward, concrete way, do you use the personal pronoun in the text? I. Do you use third person singular? He, the author. That's a gloss edge to it. The tradition is that we would not, the researcher stays out of the study, in my sense of the convention, the orthodox presentation of a thesis. In my voice is trying to communicate how would I put it? How I have used myself as a research instrument. I would acknowledge that this is a messy, database, or I would own some of the so-called imperfections, the disjointedness of my research. I think that comes out more in my voice rather than telling, the glossy, glitzy way of doing it. I'm sensing right now that my voice is not helping respond to your question. I'm going to just try opening that up to some other people who maybe that term does mean something. How would you, can anybody offer some ways that, offer a way that you think writing in your voice is activated, or you're trying to do that? So I think this is the type of theme in the day.
I would say for me being self-critical, so you're actually putting writing in justification for, say, your own interpretation or a methodological approach, and how you've pursued various methods, which, as you say, can be quite messy. You can read about the theory, but you have to actually interpret that personally. You have to be reflective about that.
Okay. Does that give an example of that flavor?
That's a good example.
Yeah, no, I think so. The idea of self-assessment, self-reflective. And again, I don't know what the convention is here, but the use of an annex or an appendix, because in a way this is an exhibit, an illustration of the edge to my research that I was trying to bring. Sometimes you can put something like that as an entry rather than it going into the text. It's not essential to the text, but it's certainly a nice exhibit of, and annexes and appendices can be used very persuasively to get the reader on board in complementing the essential text.
I think also I dwell a lot on inferences and how I interpret those inferences and what my personal experience is in relation to how I analyze those inferences and work them into the text. And that helps in terms of doing something in your own voice.
Yes, I think this whole acknowledgement of the tentativeness of something, an inference. You know, there is some, in the choice of words, the tone, there is some evidence to suggest this. I just read a lot of, especially at master's level, where they don't get as much practice in avoiding it, but a lot of the final chapters become quite prescriptive. You know, they must do this. They, you know, it's almost like a recommendation. That to me is not in my own voice. In my own voice, I want to own that. You know, if I might give the example. If I was involved in trying to do this, I would try and keep these things in mind. If I was going into that future perfect, in terms of the implications of what I've found out, things like that. So I think there's a lot to do. A lot of it has to do with, literally, with provisionalness or tentativeness. Yeah.
Can I just make an observation? I mean, you've just presented it's an example of an and. It's rather subversive in one sense of certainly the first couple of years of the doc, where there's a lot of emphasis on this is what research methodology is and so on and so on, and yet you come along and say, well, basically that's all very very nice, but really you're going to cobble together your own thing and develop your own methodology. And so that's one side of it, but on the other side, actually, in the real world, actually what you're advocating is actually what you really need to do. And it's actually strangely comforting for someone in that position who's been wrestling with methodology to think, well, actually, maybe there is, maybe what my insides are telling me to do is actually a rational and reasonable way to proceed with it. I just have a slight worry that listening to the sort of presentation you've just made, you need to be a certain way through the whole process before you begin to take on board what's being said to you. It's a bit like, your DIY does need to understand what a saw is and how to avoid doing what I did and damaging their thumb. You have to have a few basic skills before you can be an effective curricular.
Well, I think that there's two things I might pick up on that also. One is, I'm again hearing a little bit of the either or, and I think it's, the encouragement would be to hold both. We're not saying it's all of this and none of this, or all of that and none of this. There are two sides to that coin. There is your creativity, your adaptation, your bricolage in it, and there are some pretty clear programmed syllabus guidance about how you academic conventions of how you present something. If you choose to say, I'm going to be really creative, you do that at your risk. So there's a question of, there's a span here to play with between what is established and what you can create and can construct. The other part is this business of two types of learning again. Your significant learnings about how you're doing your research will be your awareness after the experience of doing it. So yes, true to what I was saying in the paper, the so-called mode 1 of learning, the experiential learning, the action learning, where you do something and then you have a scope to reflect on it and try and find its sense and awareness after the experience. That's just one of those perverse realities in life, that you will be doing a lot of stuff which you will, I'll rephrase it. Many people learn how to do doctoral research by the end of having done it this first time.
Very true. Very true.
What higher education is committed to, for various reasons, some decent, some less decent, is to get you to know how to do it before you start doing it. I would maintain that you will have significant learning halfway through, at the end of doing it. I know much more about doing this stuff now, having done mine 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Yeah, so I think, yeah.
When you finish, you think, if only I knew then what I know now, it would have been a better thesis.
Yeah. And I think that's where your own voice can also, you can offer that reflection as a concluding annex, or as a personal reflection in the last, if that's the convention here. But that incorporates your own voice. You become a living, real person, which often in classical research or formal research has not been encouraged.
So should our thesis be setting out how we've gone through the learning process, effectively?
I have to draw boundary management here in my role, and that will be certainly addressed, and want to make sure you ask that again today.
Well, actually, I was going to ask the same question. I take you to be advocating honesty and truthfulness, and therefore authenticity, not only in the way that you behave in your research, but in the way that you write it down. And you said something earlier on about drawing the contrast between how the research methodology books say that it pans out, and how we all know it actually pans out in reality. And I suppose that the message that I've given to the Salford professional doctorate students, which was actually summarised far better by somebody else, one of the speakers that came to talk to us, she said, when you're undertaking your research, you are undertaking the role of detective. When you're writing your thesis, you're undertaking the role of advocate. And maybe that's just my conditioning, but that struck a chord with me. And you seem to be advocating something slightly different, in that you should stay as a detective even when you're writing the thesis.
That's an interesting. I suppose if advocacy does not degenerate into prescription, yes. There are some things, people get so caught up in what they found out, they think this is the be-all, end-all to solve the world's problems. I want to caution people, and that's where the tentativeness, the provisionalness, the verb tense, the conditional verb tense all helps, I think. But it's nice, I think, to track the different shifting roles that one takes at different phases, and certainly the detective. Only if the detective realizes that you're not after one solution, that there was a crime and one person committed it. So it's a detective who is more open-ended. There's something wrong out here, and I'll try and find out what it is, perhaps.
Yeah. Does that answer your question then?
Sort of. I remember originally my understanding was doctorates came about because it was a method for universities to check whether someone had the skills to teach. And so it was the learning process is to learn how to use the methodologies so that you can then go into teaching.
it's changed now. It's not
Mm.
seen as that anymore. And I've certainly treated this as a learning experience at the end of which, if I've learnt enough, I'll pass, rather than I have to know how to do it all before I start. Because if that's the case, what's the point in doing it? Why can't I just apply for my doctorate now and be given it? So that's why I'm just interested to see whether I use the thesis as sort of not quite a diary of my learning, but showing how I started with a problem, and through research I found out more about that problem, albeit I may not have solved it.
And I have to own my bias here, which I'm sure was fairly transparent, sorry, Charles, that I'm much more curious and intrigued by the candidates' how journey, how have I learned, how have I found my way through in conducting this investigation, rather than necessarily what it is I'm contributing to the stock of knowledge. Because ultimately the what is going to disappear into the smoke, horizon. But what's left is things that you're going to take with you for the rest of your life. And I think that's just my own bias where I come from. And I'm not a specialist in one particular field anyway. So.
Can I just
Sorry.
add to what you just said? There is a sense, and there's some truism in what you said. There is a sense that a prof doc student or a research student should procedurally understand the procedure of how to do research. Not so much how to go and teach, but how to do research. And I think what we've heard from Pete is that there are noises out there, and there's no absolute in social science. And one of the things one would expect you is to show some understanding of that noise around there, and how you've navigated, given your context within that noise, and come out the other way. I think that's what captures what you presented today.
That's a nice image for me.
Yeah, and I think that's what we would be expecting a student. There's no best way, it's all contextual. But show us to have some understanding of what's around you as you navigate your path.
Yeah.
That's
No,
your triangle, isn't it?
Sorry?
That's your triangle that you started off with, your hypothesis, your academic, and your synthesis.
Yeah. And that noise is largely a lot of the stuff down in the bottom, in the what I call a plurality, or the social nature of it. That's where a lot of the noise comes in, I think.
Just to further to that point, I would tend to say when you write it in the methodology section, it becomes clear, to take the point that Charles has just made, there's obviously a lot written out there about the methodology and methods you can adopt, and it should be relatively clear through writing the section the choices that you have available to you, and how you navigated through those choices and made a choice that is relevant to your particular research. And it should be, in my view, fairly clear through that what you have actually therefore learned in terms of doing your particular piece of research, but also what you've learned in terms of being a researcher.
Yeah.
That's my feeling anyway.
And I think this is where the business about how some of these learnings come into play long on. This idea of criteria evolved from making some of these choices. You already made the choices, then you rationalize afterwards, well, the reason I made that choice was, it could be, and this is what was referred to by this guy Collins in a special issue on qualitative analysis back in the, I think it's in the references in the sociological review, a chronological lie. You justify what you did after, because now you've got insight and awareness about what the issues were, and your best shot at it was this. So you, and this is where your verb tense comes in. You ethically re-engineer. Thank you, Charles. Exactly.
And that's the worry, choosing the wrong methodology when you start out, because through the research process you might realise actually that wasn't quite right, and it switches as you're going along.
So what do you try and do to choose the right methodology?
Well, through investigating what others have used and what results they've ended up with, and choosing what you think is the best fit at the outset, but then doing, as you're both saying, when you then write it up, you go back and And that's why I was asking whether I can just tell what I've learned through, or do I have to go back and rewrite it?
I would also encourage, in addition to checking out what other people have done, is to ask yourself, I've got this curiosity, this focus, these questions. What types of information do I need to be able to bring something original, something fresh, to answering these questions, to satisfying my curiosity? In other words, it's more the phenomenal approach, the experiential approach, before you get into the categories of research and the classifications of research. Find out, at the primal level, what is it, you think will help you. Then go out to the shopping mall and find out is there a method that seems to provide information of that type, something like that. But, get yourself into that. That's again part of your own voice operating.
I would say there's probably, I wouldn't call it a lie or dishonest. It's this retrospective revisiting of what actually happened. I think I prefer to call it a tidying up.
That's a lie.
It's about reflecting on the messiness that was, and formulating a theory that actually conveys to the reader what process you went through without actually exposing them to all the unnecessary messiness which is actually interfering with your message, I would say. So I don't actually see
you
that.
need sleepless nights then.
I don't have sleepless nights. I'm a lawyer then. Well, thank you everybody for your contributions to that. And thank you, Pete, especially for that thought-provoking presentation. I'm afraid we have to draw it to a close now because coffee beckons, but if we could just show our appreciation, please, to Pete. So